Why being alone changes you forever. Jung insight. The story most people have been told about isolation goes like this. If you keep pulling away from people, from conversation, from the noise of ordinary social life, something must be wrong with you. You failed to connect, or you gave up trying, or some quiet wound drove you inward and never let you back out. It's a tidy explanation, and it has the advantage of keeping the social order intact, because if the person who withdrew is broken, everyone who stayed doesn't have to examine why they stayed, or what exactly they're participating in, or whether belonging is costing them something they haven't named yet. But this explanation was designed for people who never look too closely at what actually happens when someone begins to see through the performance. Because what happens isn't a failure of belonging, it's a change in perception. And once that perception changes, distance becomes less of a choice and more of an inevitability. You probably already felt the shift before you had words for it. The moment conversations started sounding rehearsed. The moment someone's kindness began carrying a transactional weight you couldn't quite name. The moment you realized that most relationships were surviving on a shared agreement not to look at certain things too directly. When that happened, something in you withdrew, not dramatically, not with a door slamming, just quietly. You stopped reacting in the old ways, stopped explaining, stopped pretending not to notice, and the people around you felt it, even if they couldn't say what they felt. Because when someone steps off the social script, everyone else becomes briefly visible in a way they usually aren't. Their insecurities surface. The mechanisms behind their warmth become apparent. Their carefully constructed identities lose a little of their credibility. You saw too much, and once that kind of perception develops, it doesn't dull back down. What society says about the person who walks away. Carl Jung understood something about solitude that most of his contemporaries, and most of ours, preferred not to examine, that certain kinds of aloneness don't come from failure to belong. They come from perception. From the moment a person starts noticing the hidden architecture beneath ordinary human behavior, the masks, the quiet power games, the dependence on validation that governs so much of what passes for connection, something irreversible begins. You stop participating the way you once did. Not because you hate people, but because you can no longer convincingly ignore what you see. And the sharper your perception of those patterns becomes, the more friction you generate in social spaces that depend on everyone agreeing not to name them. Society has always had a particular reaction to the person who stops needing the crowd. First, they are misunderstood, then avoided. Eventually, feared, because a person who no longer needs the group's approval cannot be controlled by it, and the group has very few tools left at that point. History treats these figures consistently, as warnings, as people who drifted too far, as cautionary examples of what happens when someone fails at the basic human project of belonging. The lone wolf, in the cultural story, is the person who couldn't make it work. But Jung's reading of this figure was considerably less comfortable. He saw someone who had walked through a specific psychological passage, not around it, not back from it, but through it, and came out changed on the other side in ways that made them genuinely difficult to manage. Not violent, not hostile, just impossible to steer through the usual mechanisms. The figure of the alone one, the person who stopped requiring the group's approval, has always been treated as a problem to solve or a symptom to diagnose. But Jung would say the diagnosis belongs somewhere else. It belongs on the mechanism by which most people construct identity in the first place. The mask that became the self. From the time you were young, you were quietly trained to construct something. Jung called the persona a social mask, calibrated to make you acceptable to whatever group you needed to belong to. You learned which emotions were rewarded and which created problems, which opinions generated friction, which parts of your actual personality needed to be softened, suppressed, or simply kept out of the room if you wanted to stay included. And so, you adapted. You edited your instincts. You softened the edges. You shaped yourself into someone easier for the group to absorb. At first, this felt like social intelligence, even like maturity, reading the room, adjusting accordingly, not making things difficult unnecessarily. But over time, something quieter happened. You stopped expressing who you were and started managing how you were perceived. These are not the same activity, but they can impersonate each other for years without you noticing the difference. This is the silent contract that most people operate under their entire lives. Approval in exchange for authenticity. And the longer someone maintains that exchange, the more their identity becomes dependent on external input. Their sense of self stops emanating from within and starts coming from reactions, from praise, from social acceptance, from the mirror of other people's approval. Remove that mirror, and the structure becomes uncertain. This is part of why the thought of real solitude terrifies so many people. Solitude removes the audience. There's no validation, no applause, no one telling you through their reactions who you're supposed to be. Just you. And for someone who has spent years performing a persona and mistaking that performance for identity, that silence becomes almost physically unbearable. So they cling to the group even when the conversations feel hollow, even when the relationships are clearly conditional, even when they can feel themselves slowly abandoning parts of what they actually are. Belonging, in this condition, becomes more important than truth. That is not a personal failing. It's an entirely predictable consequence of how the social system was constructed. But something unusual starts happening when a person begins seeing through this mechanism clearly. The persona stops feeling protective. It starts feeling suffocating, like a room that used to be safe and now has no windows. You notice the quiet lies people tell to preserve social harmony. You notice how often honesty disrupts the balance of a room. You notice how quickly the appearance of authenticity is rewarded while the actual thing creates tension. And once you see it clearly, participating in it requires a kind of effort that starts to feel like betrayal of something you can't quite name yet. Your response is slow. Your tolerance for performance shrinks. Others begin to feel something in you pulling back from the game they're still playing. And here is the real tension. Groups are built on shared illusions, and when someone stops reinforcing those illusions, they introduce instability not by attacking the system, but simply by refusing to perform inside it. Your silence becomes uncomfortable. Your directness unsettles people. Your distance reads as something suspicious, and this is when you realize something that cuts in an unexpected direction. You were never afraid of being alone. You were afraid of being yourself. But once that realization settles, the mask becomes harder to keep on, and the more it cracks, the more the crowd begins to recede. The rupture that started everything, the transition into real psychological aloneness, rarely begins with a decision. It begins with a rupture, a moment when the illusion holding your social world together suddenly cracks open, and you cannot put it back together the way it was before. For many people, this arrives through betrayal. Not always the dramatic kind. Often it's quiet, almost ordinary. A friend who disappears the moment you stop being useful. A relationship where loyalty evaporated the second comfort was threatened. A group that praised honesty in theory right up until you actually practiced it. At first you rationalize it. You tell yourself people are complicated, that loyalty has limits, that you must have misread the situation. But something in you keeps observing. Patterns start aligning across different people and different contexts. You notice how quickly warmth disappears when status is involved. You notice how often people defend lies that protect their self-image. You notice how easily a relationship can shift the moment you stop providing a specific kind of emotional labor. And eventually, the realization arrives not as a dramatic revelation but as a quiet settling. Most connections were never as stable as they appeared. They were agreements, unspoken exchanges of validation, usefulness, and emotional convenience, dressed up as friendship or love. Once you see that clearly, something inside you detaches, not emotionally at first, but cognitively. You start watching people instead of simply trusting them. You observe reactions, notice contradictions, track how behavior changes depending on who holds power in the room and who's watching. The more accurately you read those patterns, the less convincing the social performance around you becomes. And this is when withdrawal begins, not loudly, but quietly. You stop explaining yourself, stop chasing conversations that feel forced, stop maintaining relationships that only function when you're suppressing large portions of who you actually are. From the outside, this looks like distance, like something going wrong, but internally, something different is happening. Your illusions are collapsing, and when illusions collapse, the emotional investment that was tied to them goes with them. Your reactions slow down, your patience for social performance drops. People feel the difference immediately, because the moment you stop needing validation, you also stop being predictable. And predictability is what most social systems run on. Friends expect reassurance, groups expect agreement, relationships expect a certain emotional compliance. But now you pause before responding. You observe before committing. You decline things you once tolerated. People interpret your silence as arrogance, your detachment as judgment, your independence as a form of rejection. They can't see the psychological process running underneath it. They only see that you're no longer participating in the expected ways. So the distance grows not through conflict, usually, but through subtle separation. Conversations lose their warmth. Interactions become transactional. People gravitate toward those who mirror their worldview instead, and you feel the circle getting smaller. Most people panic at this stage and rush back toward the group, apologize for their honesty, rebuild the persona, restore the illusion just to recover the connection. But some don't. Some keep walking further into the realization. And that is the actual psychological turning point. Because once you accept what you've seen about human behavior, returning to the illusion doesn't feel possible anymore. This is where the lone wolf is formed. Not through pride, not through rebellion, but through disillusionment. What isolation actually does to perception. Isolation does something to perception. It sharpens it. What most people call isolation, Jung understood as individuation, not a lifestyle choice, not a personality type, but a specific psychological process that begins the moment a person confronts the parts of themselves that society had taught them to bury. Jung called this buried structure the shadow, not simply darkness or cruelty, but everything that had to be suppressed in order to belong. Your aggression, your ambition, your skepticism, your refusal to go along with things that don't make sense to you, even your honesty, when honesty was inconvenient. Every trait that made the group uneasy was pushed out of your social identity and stored underground, not destroyed, hidden, waiting. Because the group rewards predictability above most things. A person who is agreeable, emotionally manageable, and easy to categorize is easy to keep. But someone who begins expressing their shadow, their direct perception, their instinct to push back, their unwillingness to perform what's expected creates instability in systems that depend on everyone playing their assigned role. So most people suppress those traits indefinitely. They keep the shadow underground, perform the persona, and spend their lives managing appearances in an exhausting way. They've long since stopped noticing is exhausting at all. Individuation begins when that repression fails, when the parts of you that were pushed into the dark start returning to the surface. At first, this feels chaotic. You notice emotions you once managed away. You feel anger where you previously felt guilt. You recognize instincts you used to deny. This is not regression, it's integration. But it carries a side effect that compounds the social difficulty. When you start integrating your own shadow, you stop projecting it onto other people. And projection is part of the psychological glue holding most social relationships together. People project their aggression onto enemies, their insecurity onto rivals, their suppressed desires onto strangers, and these projections maintain a kind of emotional balance that most people don't even know they're relying on. But when you confront your own shadow honestly, those projections collapse. You start seeing people as they actually are, not as heroes, not as villains, not as saviors or threats, just as human beings operating through their instincts, their fears, and their self-interest, most of it unconscious. This shift changes your expectations significantly. Your emotional reactions soften. Your trust becomes more selective. You stop romanticizing people. And that adjustment, quiet as it is internally, unsettles the people around you in ways they can't always articulate. Because people rely on projection to maintain their own identity. They need someone to admire, someone to blame, someone to compete with. But someone who has withdrawn those projections becomes difficult to place. You don't idolize them. You don't fear them. You don't chase their approval. You observe. And that observation makes people uncomfortable because it feels like you're seeing something they'd rather keep private. Friends begin feeling strangely exposed around your calm. Your lack of emotional reactivity reads as cold. Your independence removes the leverage people usually rely on without naming it. And people react to disruption. Instinctively, they withdraw. They label you distant or antisocial or difficult, not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped pretending not to see. This is what Jung described as the lonely road of individuation, a period where the old performed identity dissolves, but the integrated self hasn't fully stabilized yet. You no longer belong to the persona you once maintained, but you haven't yet built the psychological structure that replaces it. So the world becomes quieter, not peaceful, exactly, but quieter. Fewer conversations feel meaningful. Fewer relationships survive the shift. And that is why this stage feels like isolation. But the truth is more precise. The lone wolf is not isolated. He is integrated. He has reclaimed the parts of himself that were traded away for social acceptance. When awareness makes you impossible to steer, once others realize you can't be moved through the usual mechanisms, something shifts in how they treat you. People test influence instinctively, and mostly without realizing it. It's not a calculated strategy so much as a behavioral reflex. They watch how you respond to disagreement. They observe whether disapproval changes your behavior. They push subtly to see if social pressure adjusts how you act. When nothing changes, when praise doesn't pull you closer, and criticism doesn't push you away, and belonging doesn't seem to require your compliance anymore, something shifts in their perception. You become unpredictable, not aggressive, not hostile, but unmanageable. You listen more than you speak. You notice contradictions people hoped you missed. You decline invitations that exist purely to maintain appearances, and the more calmly you do it, the more unsettling it feels to everyone watching, because someone who sees through social dynamics quietly exposes them, simply by not participating. You notice when kindness is strategic rather than genuine. You notice when confidence is insecurity wearing better clothes. You notice when charm is manipulation delivered politely. You rarely confront any of it directly. You simply refuse to engage. And that silent refusal changes how people experience your presence. They feel observed, not judged, observed. Their usual approaches to gaining influence or generating emotional reactions stop producing results. Their subtle power plays collapse before they fully form. That absence of control creates a tension the human mind handles poorly, because the mind is genuinely uncomfortable around people it cannot influence. So explanations get assigned. You're arrogant, detached, antisocial. These labels restore psychological comfort by making you the problem. Because accepting the real explanation would be more disturbing. You're not difficult to control, you simply cannot be controlled through the methods they know. You don't chase approval. You don't fear rejection. You don't shape your identity around group acceptance. And that removes the leverage most people unconsciously rely on. What the world looks like from here. The first place the shift becomes visible is in your relationships. You stop over-explaining yourself, where you once clarified your intentions, justified your decisions, and smoothed over every misunderstanding before it could harden into anything. You now let silence stand. If someone misinterprets you, you don't rush to correct it because you've come to understand something most people spend enormous energy avoiding. People rarely misunderstand you by accident. They interpret you in the way that best protects their own narrative. And once you understand that, the exhausting project of managing other people's perceptions loses most of its appeal. If someone wants to understand you, they will find a way. If they don't, any explanation you offer just becomes another performance. And you no longer perform. This changes dynamics quickly. Some people get uneasy with the lack of reassurance. Others quietly drift when they realize emotional leverage no longer produces results. Relationships that required constant validation begin fading not through conflict, but through absence. Then the shift appears in how you occupy social spaces. You speak less, not because you have less to think, but because you no longer feel the pressure to fill every silence. Most social environments run on constant noise. Opinions, reactions, small talk specifically designed to maintain the illusion of connection. But once you're observing more than participating, the machinery becomes obvious. You notice how often conversations are really competitions for attention, how often humor is insecurity wearing a better costume, how often people publicly agree while privately thinking something entirely different. So you listen instead. You watch how people behave when they believe no one is particularly paying attention. And that observation makes you harder to read. Your reactions slow down, and where people expect immediate emotional engagement, they meet quiet evaluation instead. That pause unsettles people, because it breaks a rhythm they were used to controlling. The same shift appears in professional environments built on hierarchy. You stop orbiting around recognition, stop volunteering for the politics, disengage from conflicts that exist purely to feed someone's ego. And something interesting happens. Some people start respecting you more, while others begin resenting you. Because when someone refuses to participate in social competition, they expose how much of the whole system depends on it. What gets built in the quiet? At some point, the realization becomes unavoidable. Your distance from most people is no longer temporary or situational. It's structural. You start recognizing it in how you move through the world now, in how quickly conversations that used to hold your attention dissolve, in how spaces that once felt normal now feel like theatrical productions you can see the scaffolding of. You notice the scripts people follow, the polite lies offered out of habit rather than kindness, the emotional negotiations, the invisible hierarchies embedded in everyday interaction. And participating in those things requires a kind of effort that feels less and less worth making, not because you've become superior to them, but because you can see them too clearly to pretend otherwise. So your behavior changes. You choose silence where you once chose agreement. You choose clarity over belonging. And that shift quietly redraws your identity. You didn't become antisocial, you became selective. You didn't lose empathy, you lost tolerance for dishonesty. You didn't detach from people, you detached from illusions about them. The circle shrinks, not because you rejected connection, but because most available connections require you to stop seeing what you can already see. And you no longer do that. The more conscious you become, the fewer environments feel natural. The more precise your perception, the more carefully you choose who actually has access to you. Attention becomes selective. Trust has to be earned. The emotional energy you once distributed freely is now allocated carefully. Some people interpret this as coldness, others as arrogance. The truth is simpler. You didn't become cold. You became conscious. And conscious individuals operate differently. They observe longer, speak less, attach slowly. Not because they lack empathy, but because they understand the actual cost of misplaced loyalty. This transformation carries a consequence most people don't anticipate, because emotional independence changes how the world responds to you. Once people realize you can't be brought back in through approval or excluded back in line through rejection, you stop being treated as a member of the group dynamic. You get treated as something adjacent to it, someone whose reactions can't be predicted, someone whose approval can't be reliably purchased, someone who sees the system and isn't depending on it. History has always treated those individuals the same way, with distance, with suspicion, and eventually with a kind of quiet fear because you cannot control what doesn't need you. Eventually, if you stay with it long enough, the noise fades, not because the world gets quieter, but because you stop needing to answer it. The urgency to be understood loosens its grip. The compulsion to explain yourself dissolves. The constant background negotiation for belonging simply stops. And in that silence, something unfamiliar begins taking shape. Not dramatic peace, not some elevated spiritual state, but clarity. You start seeing people without the emotional distortions that used to shape your perception. Their fears become readable. Their performances become predictable. Their reactions stop landing as personal, because you recognize them now as patterns. The same patterns you ran yourself for years before you stopped. That recognition removes something subtle but significant. The need to fight them. You stop trying to wake people up. Stop trying to correct illusions. Stop expecting depth from environments built for surface interaction. Instead, you move differently, more deliberately, with less of the quiet desperation for approval that governs so much social behavior. From the outside, this looks like detachment. Internally, it's something else. It's self-possession. Your direction is no longer negotiated through praise or adjusted under pressure. Your values travel with you instead of adapting to whatever room you've entered. Your identity is no longer borrowed from external mirrors. It's constructed from the inside out. And once that internal alignment settles, solitude stops feeling like punishment. It becomes something closer to space to think without background noise, to act without performing, to remain intact inside a world that applies constant pressure to shape you into something more convenient. Not everyone reaches this point. Most turn back long before the quiet becomes comfortable. But for those who don't, something simple eventually becomes clear. Being alone was never the problem. Losing yourself to avoid it was. The path doesn't lead back to the crowd. It leads somewhere smaller and considerably more honest, to whatever version of yourself was always underneath the performance, waiting without urgency, needing nothing from you except your willingness to finally stop apologizing for it. Now, I'd like to share a meaningful story with everyone. Emily Avenue. It was an accident. That's the first thing I need to say. I'm a fuck-up, not a killer, but that doesn't change what happened that night. This is what happened. I was driving home in my mother's car. It was late, and I was high. I had the radio going loud enough to wake up all the dark houses. I always drive fast. Not crazy fast, but fast. Out my window, on somebody's lawn, I saw this giant inflated Snoopy lit up from the inside. It was this big white blur. I was driving too fast. I already admitted that. I made mistakes. At the bottom of the hill, there's a stop sign. I didn't see any car lights. I didn't hear anything but my music. When I got close to the stop sign, I punched the gas. It's this game I play with myself when I'm coming home late and fucked up. I get some speed, and when I don't see any headlights, I fly past that stop sign at the bottom of the hill. There's a bump there, and when I get a little momentum going, I can get a little air. I didn't see any lights coming up or down Emily Avenue. I hit that bump hard and flew past that stop sign, and that's when I slammed into that guy's car. His car just appeared like a ghost car. He didn't have the headlights on. I killed him. It wasn't the dude's fault. I'm not saying that, but he didn't have the headlights on. His girl was staring at me. I saw her eyes right before it happened. Her eyes were wide open, watching me, and then she was crying and holding on to that dead guy. Henry. I killed him. I know that. But he didn't have his headlights on. I would have slowed down. I would have waited for him to drive by. I left. I put my mother's car into reverse, and I drove away. I was stoned and scared. I had some warrants and weed in the car. I drove home and took all the money from my mother's purse. It wasn't much. I drove to Lynchburg in her car until the engine gave out, and then I left it there, smoking, behind a 7-Eleven store. My cousin used to live in Lynchburg, but I guess he must have moved because when I went to his apartment, this Japanese guy lived there and he said he'd never heard of my cousin. I walked around all night. I didn't know what else to do. In the morning, I went to this mall. I had to cross this 4-lane highway, and part of me wanted to just step in front of a truck. You know that feeling? But I ran instead. I ran into the mall parking lot. It was Saturday. Inside, I got warmed up and ate a steak sandwich. These girls were looking at me, laughing. I don't blame them for looking at me. I was dirty and eating so fast. These girls, They were nibbling on chicken fingers and French fries. All my life, I've seen girls like these girls, but I've never talked to one of them. They were just here to shop, and then they'd go home. They'd sleep in a nice bed and never feel like me or remember me. That's the way it is with most people. You only think about the people you love or hate, and everyone else is just scenery. They're just people eating food in a mall or walking out of the movies. That's what I did that night. I watched people walk out of the movies at this multiplex theater in the mall. Some of the couples held hands. I thought about my brother and my mother. I thought about that guy I killed. I thought about that exact moment when he turned his head and noticed, for the first and last time, my car about to crash into him. I wonder if he knew, in that second, that his life was almost over. I wonder who he thought about, what he might have said. His girl was beside him. Maybe he said her name out loud and maybe she said, "I'm right here." That wouldn't be such a bad way to go, if you think about it all the time, like I do. Dear viewers, that was our channel's discussion on the topic. Why being alone changes you forever. Jung Insight. If you found this video helpful or meaningful, please consider subscribing to support the channel. If you'd like me to create more content about emotions, relationships, or other psychological topics, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I'll do my best to help you understand why you're feeling the way you do and what's really happening beneath the surface. For now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you.